Good morning again. Let's open our Bibles to John chapter 18. John chapter 18. Text will be verses 12 through 27. Let us hear the word of the Lord. Beginning in verse 12. So the band of soldiers and their captain and the officers of the Jews arrested Jesus and bound him. First they led him to Annas, for he was the father-in-law of Caiaphas, who was high priest that year. It was Caiaphas who had advised the Jews that it would be expedient that one man should die for the people. Simon Peter followed Jesus, and so did another disciple. Since that disciple was known to the high priest, he entered with Jesus into the courtyard of the high priest. But Peter stood outside at the door. So the other disciple, who was known to the high priest, went out and spoke to the servant girl, who kept watch at the door, and brought Peter in. The servant girl at the door said to Peter, "You also are not one of this man's disciples, are you?" He said, "I am not." Now the servants and officers had made a charcoal fire because it was cold, and they were standing and warming themselves. Peter also was with them, standing and warming himself. The high priest then questioned Jesus about his disciples and his teaching. Jesus answered him, "I have spoken openly to the world. I have always taught in the synagogues and in the temple, where all Jews come together. I have said nothing in secret. Why do you ask me? Ask those who have heard me what I said to them. They know what I said." When he had said these things, one of the officers standing by struck Jesus with his hand, saying, "Is that how you answer the high priest?" Jesus answered him, "If what I said is wrong, bear witness about the wrong. But if what I said is right, why do you strike me?" Annas then sent him bound to Caiaphas, the high priest. Now Simon Peter was standing and warming himself, so they said to him, "You also are not one of his disciples, are you?" He denied it and said, "I am not." One of the servants of the high priest, a relative of the man whose ear Peter had cut off, asked him, "Did I not see you in the garden with him?" Peter again denied it, and at once a rooster crowed. Last week, we were given a glimpse into the Garden of Gethsemane. We were able to look at these final moments Jesus had with his disciples prior to his arrest. And what looked like a defeat in that garden was actually a victory, as Jesus voluntarily walked forward to be arrested as a substitute. And all the while that he was being arrested, all the while that he was on his way to the cross, he held his disciples fast, that their faith might not fail. Demonstrating John's own commentary on Jesus in chapter 13, verse 1, of Christ's faithfulness, John writes this, "Having loved his own who were in the world, he loved them to the end." And when you read that verse in chapter 13, verse 1, you'll notice, having loved his own who were in the world. It's them, his own. That's what's qualified. He loved them to the end, keeping hold of them. And this microphone is driving me mad. So I'm just going to turn it off. You can hear me, correct? Jesus held his own. He kept them, and he preserved them, and they persevered, not because of their faith, because their faith would have failed, but because Christ was faithful to them. And Jesus did this in so many ways that night when he directed his very arrest away from the disciples to himself, so that the authorities would come after him and he would spare his disciples. And when Peter attacked Malchus, the slave of the high priest, Jesus intervened, preventing an arrest of Peter or an armed battle taking place. In that garden, Peter swings at the high priest's servant's head, trying to take his head off, and misses as the man ducks and cuts his ear off. Jesus restores his ear and says, Peter, put your sword away. And this sets the scene for the second act of this faithful hour that we just read of. Peter, as we last saw him puffed up with his chest sticking out, strikes a man with a knife, despite the fact that they were outnumbered at least 16-1. 11 disciples and at least 200 Roman soldiers, and plus the officers that had come with the Jewish leaders. But this is what we've come to expect of Peter, isn't it? For him to take out his sword and take matters into his own hands, as he's the outspoken leader of the 12. He was the one with Jesus on the Mount of Transfiguration. He was Jesus' most loyal disciple. He's the only one in chapter 13 that protested at Jesus washing his feet. When Jesus began to reveal that he must go to Jerusalem to be killed and raised on the third day, it's Peter in his boldness that declared, "Far be it from you, Lord, this shall never happen to you." And in the upper room, when Jesus stated that the disciples could not follow him, it's Peter who was the courageous one, the bold one, that said, "Lord, why can't I not follow you? I will lay my life down for you." And at the same time, Peter's loyalty, his outspokenness, revealed a deep-seated misunderstanding of who Christ was and who Peter was as a man. For Peter also received the sharpest and the harshest rebukes from Christ. When he said, "Lord, you shall not wash my feet," the Lord responded to him, "If I do not wash you, you have no share with me." When Peter said, "They shall never do this to you, Lord, far be it," it was Jesus who says, "Get behind me, Satan. You are a hindrance to me. For you are not setting your mind on the things of God, but on the things of man." What a painful rebuke that Peter received from the Lord Jesus. And when Peter says, the irony of ironies, "I will lay my life down for you," Jesus says, "Will you lay down your life for me?" Jesus goes on to say, "Truly, truly, I say to you, the rooster will not crow till you have denied me 3 times. Peter, still not getting it, takes out his sword, thinking he's going to start an armed resistance. And Jesus says, "Put your sword into its sheath." In other words, knock it off, Peter. "Shall I not drink the cup that the Father has given me? Put it away, Peter." Let me just tell you, we oftentimes make jokes about Peter. but I'll speak for myself. It's not hard to relate to Peter. He missed the big picture, and it's not hard to relate to that. He fell many times. He put his foot in his mouth at times and received rebuke publicly. It's not hard to relate to that. And I think that we can probably in some ways see a little bit of Peter in ourselves. After Jesus rebukes him to put away your sword, you almost see Peter in the garden hang his head as we read verse 12, which says, "So the band of soldiers and their captain and the officers of the Jews arrested Jesus and bound him." And there Jesus goes. Despite Peter's efforts, Matthew and Mark report that at that moment all the disciples left him and fled him. Peter didn't hang his head, he fled with the rest. But it wasn't long until Peter gathered enough courage for him to follow. But there's something about how he follows Jesus now is it's at a distance. Not typical of Peter, is it? You ever sat with a child and they don't understand personal space and they want to just get closer and closer and closer to you? That's how Peter's whole life is doing with Christ. Being close to him. But now we look at Peter and he's following Christ at a distance. They take Jesus, Peter, following at a distance. It tells us in verse 13 that they take him to Annas, for he was the father-in-law of Caiaphas, who was high priest that year. Now Annas, there's something we need to know about him. John's the only one that records what takes place with Annas. The other Gospels do not mention this scene. But he had formerly been the high priest. He had been put in power by Rome, and he had been disposed by Rome. But because the position, according to Jewish law, Mosaic law, the position of high priest was for life, the Jews would see Annas still as high priest, even though Rome had taken him out. There's something we need to know about the Jewish religion and the Roman relationship that existed, is that the Jews were the only people that were allowed to participate in their religion. And it's because they were such a thorn in Rome's side that they said, okay, you alone can worship the way you want. So the Jewish people were not just, did not just hand over all of their rights to the Roman authorities without a fight, without an annoyance to them. And so they made special privileges. But for Rome, a pagan group of people worshiping false gods, to tell them how they ought to worship and who their high priest was unacceptable. The Jewish people still viewed Annas as high priest. We should know something about this man. He was wicked. He did not know God. And he certainly did not know the Son of God. He was corrupt. He was extremely wealthy. And we should know how he gained his wealth, because it gives us some insight of his animosity towards Christ. He gained his wealth primarily from the sale of sacrificial animals. So when pilgrims would come into Jerusalem to sacrifice as part of their worship, the priest would look at the animals and say, these are not worthy sacrifices, you must buy ours. And they were heavily inflated. He would also take their money through exchange, currency exchange. So you just imagine Jesus comes in and overturns the money tables and clears out the temple, not once, but twice, cutting into Annas' business. He doesn't like Jesus. He's very powerful. So powerful, 5 of his sons became high priests. 1 grandson became high priest, and his son-in-law, Caiaphas, was high priest. He occupied the office at this time. So it's understandable why Jesus is brought to him despite the illegality of it. Annas had no business. This is not a real trial that's going to take place here. But with his son-in-law as official high priest, he's able to still wield considerable influence. And then John tells us about Caiaphas in verse 14. It was Caiaphas who had advised the Jews that it would be expedient that one man should die for the people. And this comment reveals the shrewdness of Caiaphas as a politician. He was the consummate politician, in fact. He was able to stay under the Roman system, high priest, for 18 years. That's no small feat. But this reference that John makes takes us back to chapter 11, and I ask you to turn there to verse 45. The context is this, as Jesus has raised Lazarus from the dead, which you might think that might gain some attention, raising a man from the dead. And in verse 45, after Lazarus has been raised, it says, many of the Jews, therefore, who had come with Mary and had seen what he did, believed in him. They believed in Christ. And the authorities are aware of this. And Jesus now is a threat to their power structure. He is a threat to their false system. He is a threat to their influence. And this boils down to one thing. We say this in our time often, just follow the what? What this has to do with is money. Jesus is a threat to their pyramid scheme, of which the high priest is at the top. So notice how Caiaphas responds to Jesus and his gaining influence. In verse 49, it says this, but one of them, Caiaphas, who was high priest that year, said to them, you know nothing at all, nor do you understand that it is better for you that one man should die for the people, not that the whole nation should perish. And I want you to notice the words of Caiaphas. He views Jesus as a substitute, as a scapegoat. He meant it politically, whereas God meant it for salvation. Notice what John writes in the following verses, in verse 51. John tells us, he did not say this of his own accord, but being high priest that year, he prophesied that Jesus would die for the nation, and not for the nation only, but also to gather into one the children of God who are scattered abroad. So from that day on, they made plans to put him to death. Caiaphas was nothing more than Balaam's donkey, speaking the word of God from the evil intentions of his heart. So between Caiaphas and Annas that are introduced in chapter 18 here, we see two very powerful, wealthy, influential, wicked, evil men. Both are considered high priests. And this is where we must see some intentional irony on the part of John in mentioning the high priest. And as you look through the text, it's hard to determine who Jesus is talking to. But it makes us ask this question, who is the true high priest? And as we look at this whole entire story, you're going to see Jesus, while he's speaking to the high priest, that's sandwiched between these two incidences of Peter, who is going to deny Christ, all the while inside this interview with Annas, Jesus is interceding as high priest on behalf of his people. So as we look at this, we have to ask the question, who is the true high priest? Who makes intercession for people? And Hebrews 3:1 says, consider Jesus the apostle and high priest of our confession. So while Jesus is brought before Annas, simultaneously John is going to shift between Jesus and Peter. Look at verse 15. Simon Peter followed Jesus, and so did another disciple. Since that disciple was known to the high priest, he entered with Jesus into the courtyard of the high priest. He's following Jesus at a distance, and the other disciple is John, the author of this gospel. And John is able to go into the court of the high priest, it says, and we know that John was wealthy. He was a fisherman, but we know he was wealthy because according to Mark chapter 1, we see that his dad had hired servants. Also, many commentators remark that John was likely in the priesthood himself. So he's known to the priests for who he is. So he has this special access that not just your average person could have walked into the courtyard of Annas, but John could because they know who he is, and he's able to work his way in there. And so Jesus is separated from his disciples, standing before the authorities, bound, while the others fled, and only John and Peter followed. Verse 16 says, but Peter stood outside at the door. So the other disciple, who was known to the high priest, went out and spoke to the servant girl who kept watch at the door and brought Peter in. Just notice that sentence. Peter stood outside the door. Peter should have stayed outside the door. He should have heeded Christ's words. Pray that you do not fall into temptation. But John goes on and makes a way for Peter to come in. It says, so the other disciple, that's John, who was known to the high priest, went out and spoke to the servant girl who kept watch at the door and brought Peter in. Now, as this scene is being set, ask yourself this question. Who's keeping watch of the door? Tells us it's a servant girl. So this is not walking in the temple precincts because it would have been a soldier, it would have been a man that would have been watching the temple. So this is going into the courtyard of Annas' house, which may have been tied to the temple. But it's a servant girl here. We're going to see that she's just not some young girl. The age isn't told to us. But we should see something here is that I think it's clear Peter, who just tried to take on 200 men with a sword that was nothing more than a long knife, should not be intimidated by this girl who's watching a door that no one would pay attention to but would walk past. Well, look what happens. He says it again, the servant girl at the door said to Peter, you also are not one of this man's disciples, are you? The question is asked contemptuously by this woman. But I want you to notice the content. You also. And just hang on to that word also, because it indicates something about the company that Peter had with John. John has already entered into the courtyard. They're aware of who he is. And so she's saying, you also, like John, must be one of the followers of Christ. Now that's an important fact because Peter has seen John go in and not be accosted by these people for following Christ. That's what makes Peter's denial so unbelievable, is John, who's known as a disciple of Christ, walks in, nothing happens. So she says, you also? Are you not one of this man's disciples, are you? Now we need to cut her some slack, lest we think of her as just some curious young girl asking questions. She's not that. She's one of experience and knowledge. Or else she wouldn't be watching the door of the priest nonetheless, she's asking Peter, who had earlier demonstrated incredible courage. She's asking Peter, who had been taught by Christ himself, whoever denies me before men, I also will deny before my Father who is in heaven. Peter was there when Christ taught that in Matthew. And so when asked about being a disciple, at this crucial moment for Peter, the boldness of Peter crumbles, and he states, I am not. Calvin writes, all the strength that appears to be in men is smoke, which a breath drives away. See, Peter's denial is a denial of the faith. That's what he does. Christ is not my Lord. The question was, are you one of his disciples? That means, do you follow him? And in order to follow Christ means that Christ is Lord of your life. To live under the lordship of Christ is to say, I'm a disciple of Christ. I am a follower of Christ. What Christ tells me to do, I do. I have denied myself. I have picked up my cross, and I have followed Christ. I am a disciple of Christ. That's what she's asking. Are you that? He says, no. It's amazing that Peter is given access to the court of the high priest so that he might deny the true high priest. How feeble and weak-kneed we are. When we rely on our own courage, we always fall away. Important reminder, don't look within yourself for some sort of imagined courage that you might have, but look to Christ. Always look away from yourself. You know, I just think about this. Think about this with me. Consider how we depart from Christ. Yes, I know Jesus. And I believe in him, and I know he loves me, and I certainly love him. But follow him? That he might be Lord of my life? Not in my priorities. Not in my lifestyle. Not in my thoughts. Not in my time. Not in what I put before my eyes. Not in what I expose my ears to. Too many other things to put before Christ. You know, this last week I was reminded of Eric Liddell. You know the story of Eric Liddell. They made the movie Chariots of Fire about him. He was an Olympic gold medalist, and he was scheduled to run in the 1924 Paris Olympics. He was scheduled to run the 100 meters. And everyone said he would win. He was expected to win. Let me remind you, this is the Olympics, the pinnacle of the sports world. There was a problem with that 100-meter race, and it was this, is that it was on a Sunday. Eric Liddell says this, it has been a wonderful experience to compete in the Olympic Games and to bring home a gold medal, because he did run in the 400 and won it. But since I have been a young lad, I have had my eyes on a different prize. You see, each one of us is in a greater race than any I have run in Paris, and this race ends when God gives out the medals. You know why I bring up Eric Liddell and him not running on a Sunday? At the pinnacle of the sports world, and we know a lot of good athletes. I don't know one that's an Olympic athlete, let alone the one that is the best in the world. He viewed running on that Sunday tantamount to saying, I deny Christ before the public. I need to be worshiping my God. He He was on the world stage and the world was looking at him. And when it came to Christ, for momentary fame, he chose Christ. Do you know that had he ran that Sunday, we wouldn't be talking about Eric Liddell today. You wouldn't even know who he was. But because he stood for Christ, we are talking about him. Think about that. How that's a reversal of how our society thinks. He actually believed that if he was to put the sports world before Christ, it was as if he was denying Christ. And we look at him and we say, wow, that's radical faith. Friends, for the majority of the Christian church's history, that was what was normative. It's only in our time that we think that we can put aside Sunday as if it's not holy, as if it's not sacred, as if it's not the Lord's day. It's still the Lord's day. We're the only time in history where we think it's not the Lord's day, and that it's just something that we can brush aside. Christ died to forgive us of our sins, but he died so that we might be made righteous and live righteously, and that we might worship him. And he has prescribed, he has regulated, he has mandated in his word a way to worship him. Not how we want. Christ died for the church. He says, I lay down my life for the sheep. How could we not prioritize what Christ loves most? He loved his own to be. And he ordained that we worship together, recognizing him as our God. Not in our own way, but according to how he is prescribed. We do it perfectly? Far from it. But we stand with the Reformation, the Semper Reformanda, always reforming until Christ comes back. Always centering on Christ until he returns. And before I move on, I want you to notice the progression of Peter, because it's a familiar one. We already read it. Blessed is the man who walks not in the counsel of wicked, nor stands in the way of sinners, nor sits in the seat of mockers. And that's a downward spiral that's taking place. So first kind of turning away from God, and then you're now away from God, and then you're sitting in the fellowship of the wicked. Look what Peter does. He follows at a distance to outward denial, to communion and fellowship with the enemy. Look what it says in verse 18. Now the servants and officers had made a charcoal fire because it was cold, and they were standing and warming themselves. Peter also was with them, standing and warming himself. And so now Peter's actions confirm his words. When he says, I am not, his actions is that he is now confirming what he says. Just like Judas, he stands with those that rallied against Christ. He stands in their comfort. They're comforting one another because it's cold, so they're warming themselves. It says Peter also was with them. You underline that word with. He's with them. They're together, standing, warming themselves at a fire. Expressions of communion and fellowship together against Christ. While all of this is taking place, Jesus is before Annas. Look what it says in verse 19. The high priest then questioned Jesus about his disciples and his teaching. Now the fact that Jesus is being questioned establishes this is not a valid trial, because those that were on trial were never questioned. It was the witnesses that would be questioned in Jewish law. This is completely illegal. It's at night. This is not a valid trial. But the questions, nor Jesus' answers mattered, because the verdict had already been decided in the matter. Chapter 11, verse 53 says, so many from that day on, they made plans to put him to death. They already know what they're going to do to Jesus. This is nothing more than a fake trial. All they're trying to do is get Jesus trapped in his words. Big mistake, by the way, to try to trap Jesus in his words. So they ask him a question about his disciples and his teaching. And something else this question does, though, is it incriminates Annas and exposes that he's not a man of faith. And I want you to notice that in Jesus' response. Jesus answered him, I've spoken openly to the world. I have always taught in the synagogues and in the temple where all Jews come together. I've said nothing in secret. You've heard my teaching. You know my teaching. And so for Annas to question his teaching would be tantamount to rejecting the very scriptures that Christ taught accurately, as one with authority, as the gospel writers tell us. But Jesus' answer also beautifully contrasts with the previous scene of denial. I want you to see this in the text. He answers with 3 sentences, and notice how they all start with, I have, I have, I have. What was the question about? It's about his disciples and his teaching. So what does Jesus do here? He doesn't say anything about his disciples and says, I. It's not about them. This is about me. Leave them alone. So what's he doing here? This is what he's doing. Of those you have given me, I have not lost one. While Peter's out denying him, Christ is holding Peter in his hand. The focus is on himself and his teaching, which does 2 things. He protects his disciples, and he again establishes the illegality of this fake trial. Verse 21, he says, why do you ask me? Ask those who have heard what I have said to them. They know what I said. He's saying, do it right. If you're going to kill me, at least kill me according to the rules. But that's the problem. If they followed the rules, they would find that Christ was innocent, that he was sinless, that he was perfect. And so to demonstrate they could not play by the rules, look at verse 22. When he had said these things, one of the officers standing by struck Jesus with his hand, saying, is that how you answer the high priest? Violence. It always comes, at least the desire always comes when a person's losing. But we look at this physical abuse of Christ. Let me say that's hardly the worst offense here. That Jesus is backhanded. The worst offense is that an innocent man is on trial with the foregone conclusion already put in place to kill him. Again, I don't want you to miss what I believe to be intentional irony, and that is that how you answer the high priest? Jesus is the high priest. His response continues to reveal his perfect obedience to the law. Look at verse 23. Jesus answered him, if what I said is wrong, bear witness about the wrong. But if what I said is right, why do you strike me? This is a reference to Exodus chapter 22, verse 28, which says, you shall not revile God, nor curse a ruler of your people. Literally, Jesus' response is, if I spoke evil, he's simply asking for a fair trial. If I've done something wrong, show me what I've done wrong, which is, he's establishing the injustice of this mock trial. And that's why he's slapped. They couldn't handle that. Now, Jesus is slapped in the cheek. What does Jesus say to do when he's slapped in the cheek? But does Jesus turn the other cheek here, since he responds, exposing the fallacy of his interviewer here? Because when he's slandered, he does not slander in return, but in his selflessness, the true high priest brings truth and grace. He's not refusing to turn the other cheek. That he continues with the sham to the cross proves that point. So he's not refusing to turn the other cheek, but he's doing what we should all do when insulted with injustice. One commentator says, turning the other cheek without bearing witness to the truth is not the fruit of moral resolution, but the terrorized cowardice of the wimp. There's nothing wrong or that which should prevent a Christian from exposing a wrong, so as long as revenge and hatred are free from heart. So Annas, realizing he's not getting anywhere with Jesus, he gives up. It says in verse 24, Annas then sent him down to Caiaphas, the high priest. And it's interesting, John does not record what happens before Caiaphas. The other gospel writers do that. He doesn't record what takes place before the Sanhedrin, whereas the others do. There's nothing of this scene here in the other gospel writers. So while all of that took place, Peter's consorting with the enemy, keeping warm, comforting himself. We read this, now Simon Peter was standing and warming himself, so they said to him, you also are not one of his disciples, are you? He denied it and said, I am not. There's an important point to learn about from Peter here, and that's this, is once we give into temptation, it always gets easier. But the first time is kind of tough. Second time, third time, fourth time. It gets easier, doesn't it? While Jesus is being treated with contempt and physical abuse, Peter is warm and cozy, pretending to be one with these people. But I can't help but think that despite the warmth of the fire, how cold and unbearable must that fire have really been for Peter? And after the second denial came the third. Verse 26, one of the servants of the high priest, a relative of the man whose ear Peter had cut off, asked him, did I not see you in the garden with him? Peter again denied it, and at once a rooster crowed. Peter digs in and goes for the trifecta of denial before the high priest. I think it's important that we see how Luke describes this scene. If you go back to Luke chapter 22 with me, verses 61 through 62. Because Luke gives us an important reminder, and Luke probably interviewed Peter, and this is probably Peter's own account of what took place, which is helpful. As he denied the Lord the third time and the rooster crowed, it says, and the Lord turned and looked at Peter. And Peter remembered the saying of the Lord, how he had said to him, before the rooster crows today, you will deny me 3 times. And he went out and wept bitterly. You know, we learned something important here. and it's this contrast that we have with Judas and Peter. Both Judas and Peter both betrayed Christ. They both did it publicly, and they both did it by joining the enemy. Both also were overcome with great grief. Judas was overcome with grief too. In fact, in Matthew 27, verses 3 through 5, it says, when Judas, his betrayer, saw that Jesus was condemned, he changed his mind and brought back the 30 pieces of silver to the chief priest and the elders, saying, I have sinned by betraying innocent blood. They said, what is that to us? See to it yourself. And throwing down the pieces of silver into the temple, he departed, and he went and hanged himself. You say, though, there's a massive difference. There's an infinite gulf of difference between Peter and Judas. You see, when Judas is overcome with guilt, what does he do? He consummates his guilt by following through with another self-centered act, thinking only about Judas. He could have returned to Jesus and said, have mercy on me, Lord, and Jesus would have loved to have given that mercy to him. No repentance, no faith, just guilt. Peter, on the other hand, you remember where we left Peter. He was warming himself by a charcoal fire. The next time we run into Peter, you know where he's at? He's warming himself at a charcoal fire in chapter 21, verse 9. It says, when they got out on the land, they saw a charcoal fire in place with fish laid out on it and bread. He was with Jesus again. He sinned against Christ. He denied Christ. He had guilt. It says in verse 15, when they had finished breakfast, Jesus said to Simon Peter, Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these? And he said to him, yes, Lord, you know that I love you. He said to him, feed my lambs. He said to him the second time, Simon, son of John, do you love me? He said to him, yes, Lord, you know that I love you. He said to him, feed my sheep. He said to him a third time, Simon, son of John, do you love me? And Peter was grieved because he said to him the third time, do you love me? And he said to him, Lord, you know everything. You know that I love you. And Jesus said to him, feed my sheep. Truly, truly, I say to you, when you were young, you used to dress yourself and walk wherever you wanted. But when you are old, you will stretch out your hands, and another will dress you and carry you where you do not want to go. And you know what that was? That was Peter being crucified on a cross. And when they went to crucify him on a cross, he said, don't crucify me like my Lord. Crucify me upside down. I don't deserve to die like Christ. You know why? Peter persevered because of these words. Simon, Simon, behold, Satan demanded to have you, that he might sift you like wheat. But I have prayed for you, that your faith may not fail. And when you have turned again, strengthen your brothers. It's because Christ prayed for him. And Christ is praying for his church at this second, that they may not fail. That Christ, the true high priest, not only interceded on the cross, but he is interceding at this second. And if for 1 second he stops to intercede for us, we will lose faith. But it's Christ who holds our faith. The difference is Jesus keeps his own and has not lost one. Are you one of Christ? Or are you a Peter that needs to turn to Christ? Or are you a Judas? If you felt Christ, turn to him. Turn to him. He'll never fail you. And if you're a Judas, repent, believe, be baptized. And say, Lord, have mercy on me, even me, a sinner. Our Heavenly Father, we thank you for these words we have just read of the great faithfulness of Christ. That even while he was being denied, he held his own. And that even in our sin, Father, against you and against your Holy One, you still hold us. You still love us. When we're not worthy, you hold us and keep us. Father, I pray for the one that does not know you, that you would draw them now to saving faith. And I pray for all of us that are so oftentimes like Peter's, that we would turn and return to your fellowship again, because you are so gracious to us. It's in Christ's name we pray.